In this video we will start talking about supports, and in particular here we're going to see the canvas priming process. The priming is a preliminary process that turns a piece of fabric into a base for painting. In particular, we're going to see why do we need to process the canvas before we paint it. We're going to talk about adhesion between two materials, discussing why they stick together by the chemical and mechanical point of view. We are going to make some experiments with materials that belong to different families and somehow can live together. We are going to see the two main types of primers and their typical composition. And at the end, we're going to see why the polar acrylic primer represents a good base also for oil colors that, as we have seen, are based on polar mediums. Here we're not going to learn how to make primers, but we're going to understand how they work and what type of impact they may have on our painting. Before we start, we should say that there are other supports that can be used for oil painting, and we will have a couple of videos later where we will talk about them. But for now, we will only focus on the canvas, that it's the main support that we will use in this course. There are several reasons why we have to do this process, and the most immediate is that it will make our job much easier. The brush will run on the support more fluently, and this will give us the chance to better control what we are doing in both the phases of filling and working. In the filling, because we will be able to cover a larger area with a single load. In the working, because it will be much easier to level, blend, and fade colors. The others are more technical advantages. At first, the priming will reduce the chance of cracking for our paints once they reach an advanced state of polymerization, because it will turn a canvas into a more rigid and elastic painting base at the same time. And of course, this will mean that our painting in the long period will be more robust and resistant to mechanical stress and atmospheric changes. It will also reduce the absorption of paints, leaving to the oil colors their natural brilliance. The last is a very personal reason. In fact, by controlling the number of primers layers that we are going to use, we control if the canvas is going to be smooth or corrugate, showing the texture of the fabric or not. This is a very personal choice. There are artists that love smooth supports, and others like me that, for example, actually like to see the canvas texture on the painting. The first consideration that we have to do is that by priming a support, our oil painting is going to be composed by three different materials stuck together. The primer stacked on the canvas and the paint stacked on the primer. So I think we should spend some time to understand how the adhesion between materials works. By our point of view, there are two different levels of adhesion. The first is chemical and the second is mechanical. In some cases, we may just have one of them, and in some other case, both. Without getting too deep, there is chemical adhesion between two materials if their connection is due to a chemical reaction. For example, if between them get formed some molecular bonds. There is mechanical adhesion between two materials if they get trapped somehow mechanically one inside the other. For example, if a polymeric fluid gets absorbed inside a porous material and then becomes solid. The first thing that we have to say is that between polar and apolar materials, the difference isn't like black and white, but more like tones of grays. So, in some cases very strong, while in other cases not so much. For example, when we have talked about chemistry basic knowledge, we have seen the difference between water and turpentine. In this case, the water is polar and the turpentine is apolar. But let's see, for example, what happens if we mix some vinyl glue, which is polar, with some water that, as we said, it's also polar. And then what happens if we mix the same vinyl glue with some linseed oil that, as we said, it's apolar? At first, we're going to mix some vinyl glue with some water. We're going to start by pouring some glue in a clean glass first, and then we're going to do the same thing with the water. We can notice immediately that although they are both polar, they don't mix. To get mixed, we have to help them with a brush, and only after some time mixing we can actually see that the mixture becomes uniform. Let's do the same thing with the same glue and some linseed oil. As we did before, we are going to start by pouring our vinyl glue on a clean glass first, and then we're going to add some linseed oil. Also in this case they don't mix, and if using a brush we start mixing, we can see that there is a certain resistance to get together. But also in this case, after a certain time mixing, at the end we can blend them, even if the mixture is not completely homogeneous like it was with the water before. So in this case we were actually able to mix a polar fluid with an apolar one. Let's try something different now. We're going to mix some plaster, which is a polar material, with some water first and then with some linseed oil. As first step, we're going to pour some water in a clean glass, and then we're going to add our plaster. We can see that actually they kind of like each other, and the plaster very quickly gets dissolved inside the water. And if we help them with a brush, they turn really fast in a pretty uniform mixture. They are both very polar materials, so this was expectable. We're going to pour now some linseed oil in a clean glass, and we're going to add some plaster inside of it. We can see immediately that they don't like each other at all. They don't want to mix, and even if we are going to force them by using a brush, we can see that they are really difficult to mix. And at the end, the blend is pretty lumpy. But this also was expectable because we have already seen when we have mixed a polar pigment with some linseed oil that also in that case at the end the paint was kind of lumpy. Of course, the pigment was not so polar like the plaster we have used now, but it was still visible the difference. It's time now to see how all the things that we have seen so far are going to help us to understand how the priming process works. To prime a canvas, we have to spread a layer of primer all over the fabric that we want to process. In this way, by osmosis, the fluid gets absorbed inside the texture and the fibers of the canvas. If we let sit there our canvas for enough time, thanks to a polymerization process, the primer becomes solid and gets stuck to the fabric. This is a really strong mechanical connection. In fact, the fabric fibers get trapped inside, surrounded by the primer. Sometimes there is also chemical adhesion between them, and this just makes this very strong connection stronger. Before we go on, we have to introduce the two types of primer that we can use for this process, because from now on things are going to change, and although they both can be used as base for oil painting, they work in different ways. As you will probably imagine, the two types of primers are the polar and the apolar. The first is mostly known as acrylic primer or gesso, while the second is known as primer for oil painting. For both of them there are several recipes out there, but we are not going to discuss them. Here we are going to see the main components and how they work, in order to have an idea of what we should expect when we choose one instead of another. The first primer that we're going to discuss is the apolar, or primer for oil painting. This is also the oldest priming method. The first written recipe found in the art history seems dated at the end of the 14th century, written by a learner of a art workshop in Florence. The most used ingredients to prepare this type of primer in our time are a medium for example some linseed oil, some animal glue, for example some rabbit skin glue or some casein glue, some honey, and some Bologna's chalk. The Bologna's chalk is a specific type of plaster chemically modified by adding a molecule of water to its chemical structure to reduce the polarity and make it more suitable to work with apolar materials. To give to the canvas a uniform base color, normally they add some pigment. Most of the time it's white, but sometimes some artists may decide to use other colors. In this case, the Bologna's plaster and the pigments get trapped inside the fluid solution made by mixing the medium, the honey, and the glue in high temperature environment. The medium, which is apolar, represents a good base for oil painting. The glue helps to keep all the components together. The Bologna's chalk helps to increase the stiffness of the support, while the honey at the same time keep it elastic. And the pigment gives to the canvas the right base color for our painting. By mixing the right concentration of these ingredients, the support results to be stiff and elastic at the same time. When we spread the first coat of primer on the canvas, by osmosis it gets absorbed inside of it, sticking to the support mostly mechanically, while the following layers will stick to the first almost only by chemical adhesion. If we go very close to look at its structure, after the polymerization the primer looks smooth with a very low porosity. And for this reason the adhesion between primer and the oil paint is definitely more chemical than mechanical. Let's talk now about polar or acrylic primer. This type of priming is definitely more recent and followed the invention of the acrylic paints in the first half of the last century. Also in this case there are several recipes to prepare it. The most common ingredients are water, acrylic or vinyl glue, Bologna's chalk, and the pigment. In this case, the water is not going to be part of the process, and during the polymerization it will evaporate, leaving a quite porous structure. Since, as we have seen, there is not big repulsion between its ingredient and the mediums used in oil painting, this porosity allows both acrylics and oils to penetrate its surface and stick to it. In the first case, the adhesion is both chemical and mechanical, while in the second case it's mostly mechanical. Although acrylic primers are considered to be a universal base for painting, some artists, when it comes to oils, don't like them. In fact, since the oil paint gets absorbed by this primer, and this is a process that mostly regards the medium and only in part the pigment, it may happen that on the external surface of our painting, the concentration of medium decreases and our oil colors partially lose their natural brightness that characterizes them. It's always a good habit to give more than one coat of acrylic primer on the canvas, because the second layer penetrating the first layer partially reduces the porosity, and this helps to decrease the medium's absorption. In alternative, we can add one or more coats of oil painting primer before we start painting. As always, my suggestion on the beginning of your painting career to avoid eventual problems is to only use products ready to go made by good companies. There are many brands out there preparing both primers for a relatively decent price. And with this last suggestion, we have concluded our discussion on the canvas priming process. If you enjoyed this video, we will really appreciate if you could click on like and subscribe to our channel. It will also help us very much if you could leave a comment. Thank you for watching this video and see you in the next one.